Hello and welcome to The Loop, where we untangle today's business issues by throwing real-life scenarios at a panel of experts and ask them to deliver practical advice on how to tackle current business issues. In this episode, we're exploring the art of cybersecurity. Now, we've heard a lot about digital transformation over the past 18 months and how the coronavirus has accelerated investment in all things digital. But we're also increasingly seeing examples of cyber attacks on firms across the UK. So what does this mean for businesses? What do these threats mean for companies across the UK? And how can companies use effective and robust cybersecurity to protect themselves? Here to answer those questions, we have four excellent guests. Sheila Pancholi is Technology Risk Assurance Partner at RSM. Chris Knowles is Chief Digital Officer, also at RSM. Richard Card is Chief Information Officer at Savills. And Lee Cowie is Chief Technology Officer for Merlin Entertainments. Thank you for joining us all, and welcome to The Loop.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Well, it's fantastic to have you all here. Before we kick things off properly, it'd be great to hear a little bit more from each of you about your role, and particularly about your role within cybersecurity. So, Sheila, I'm going to come to you first. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Jon. As you say, I'm a Technology Risk Assurance Partner at RSM. I work with clients of all sizes, across all sectors, helping them to think about the growing number of challenges that businesses are faced with when it comes to technology risk. Clearly, cybersecurity and data privacy are growing risks. They're not going to go away. And it's really thinking about how pragmatic and practical we can be with our solutions in terms of helping clients to understand those risks, but manage them effectively as well.
And Chris, you also have a key role at RSM. Perhaps tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I'm Chief Digital Officer for the firm, Jon, and that includes responsibility for all of our IT operations, digital strategy, but also, crucially, our cybersecurity arrangements. And I'll be completely open, that wasn't a particular aspect of the role that I particularly thought about before taking it on. So I wouldn't say it's been a baptism of fire, because I certainly am aware of the challenges in this space. But in terms of getting to grips with how we manage those risks as a firm, that was a side of the job I hadn't especially thought about before taking it on.
Thank you, Chris. And Richard, just a little bit more about yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. My name is Richard Card. I am Chief Information Officer at Savills, so I look after our EMEA region. And I echo Chris's words very much from a moment ago, that when I first took this role, it wasn't very much a cyber first in terms of things we needed to look at, but very much it's a very important part of our role now, and a huge part of what we're doing. We're a massively diverse company, huge geographies, and lots of different property services that we offer people. So our threat landscape is done nothing but expand during the pandemic, which has given us significant challenges, and it's kept it fun.
And Lee, finally, over to you at Merlin. Tell us a little bit about your role.
Thanks, Jon. So my name's Lee Cowie. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Merlin. Many people may not have heard of Merlin, but Merlin is actually the world's second largest location-based entertainment company. We're spread out more than 130 attractions, over more than 20 countries, actually. And we operate some brands that you will be familiar with, such as Legoland's, Alton Towers, Madame Tussauds, Sea Life Centre, and the Dungeons. My role is I'm accountable for all of the technology within Merlin, of which cybersecurity is an increasingly important part. And I think as my colleagues on the panel have alluded to, I don't think many people take the top job thinking that their focus is all about cybersecurity, but you can't separate cybersecurity from the notion of doing business. It's like yin and yang, particularly as we are connecting more people, more systems, and we're living in an ever more digital age. It really now is probably one of the most important tenets of leading a technology function.
Well, you are all perfectly qualified, certainly, for the subject that we're discussing in this edition of The Loop. The aim of The Loop is to help middle market businesses untangle today's business issues. We're going to do this by setting you what we call the loop challenge. I'm going to talk you through a couple of real-life business scenarios, and we'd like you to give us some practical advice on how you would tackle each of those scenarios. So before we jump in, first of all, do you accept the Loop Challenge?
Yes, John.
we do.
That's what we like. Absolutely full-hearted. Well, let's jump in. Let's start with our first scenario. You've recently started a new role as Chief Technology Officer for a well-known business. After many years of neglecting investment, the business has decided to invest in technology and digitalization across all its operations. And you've had sign-off now for a new digital transformation project, which will help move the business forward. All the information collected on your employees, customers, and partners will now be kept in a cloud-based platform provided by a third-party service provider. But in the last week, you've discovered a data breach, and it occurred just before you were appointed to the role. So you're struggling now to find out what exactly happened, why it happened, and what measures have been implemented to stop it from happening again. So things are occurring before you've even arrived. Sheila, I'll come to you first. What would your immediate response to that be? What would your approach be?
I think for me, John, it's about actually, has that attack been contained? Has it been closed down completely? Because, more than often we go out to help clients in effect with the incident management side of an incident. And it's almost post-recovery, and they feel as if things have been done. There's been a mini investigation, maybe things have started to be deleted, and it's almost as if we're okay, we're in a good place now. But I think that containment piece is really, really important. A thorough investigation. Don't delete anything, because actually you need everything to do a forensic investigation to really understand what was the root cause, where did the attack happen from, and actually has it been fully contained. So
there's a bit of CSI here then.
Absolutely.
The crime scene needs to be preserved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, preservation is really, really important, John, particularly if you want to try and get back to the root cause. And also, if you're going to have to put new defences in place, for example, knowing where that attack came from, its origin, having as much information as possible to do that. And
Chris, what would you add to that?
I think just reflecting on the fact that we're a week into this role, John, the first thing I'll be trying to find out will be what's the incident response protocol in this organisation, if there is one. Let's hope there is, because so many organisations scrabble around figuring out, well, who do we need to notify? Who's in the comms loop on this one? What's the escalation path? And Sheila's quite right that priority number one is containing it. But really, I think priority number two, as you go through that containment, is just figuring out who needs to know.
So talk me through that protocol a bit more.
We see varying types of procedures in organisations. Actually, we see lack of incident response procedures and processes more than we actually see what I would call an incident playbook, which in effect it's almost like a step-by-step guide. If this happens, what do we do and how do we deal with it? And it takes you through the lines of responsibility and accountability. Who's going to be responsible for PR? Who's going to be responsible for informing a regulator?
I think there's a really interesting point you raised there, Sheila, about the value of playbooks, and it's a standard tool. Is that you rehearse these things, you think about it. But I think the key word there, and in this scenario that perhaps makes it difficult, is that they're only really any good if you actually practice them and you rehearse them and you find out where they work and where they don't work. And I think coming into this job, you're going to have to make some pretty brave decisions if your first week is faced with a cybersecurity challenge. So I think you do need to go to the playbook. I think it's there, but you also need to look at the rest of your team. You need to look at who's on the pitch with you. Have they rehearsed cybersecurity before? Have they not? What's their maturity? What's their capability? And I think as well, because in this case it's a third-party platform, what are their credentials? What's their capability? Do they have a cyber book? And I think, I'm looking at this job thinking, maybe not.
Maybe not here for the long term.
I was just thinking, after the first week, if this is the first time you've heard about it, then you might want to consider finding a different job, actually. But I think just from my point of view, I agree with all the points as the panel have already said. I think in this scenario, it's very tempting to start shutting things down, panicking slightly. but really finding out your internal capabilities from a technical standpoint, because then you can have a think about what you're going to need to find in terms of a third party, because everyone needs help in some of these scenarios. So be ready to do that, but identify what you have within your skill set first. I think it's quite key.
And Lee, you obviously working for a large international organization like Merlin, have the infrastructure there to hand. But again, we're this mid-size business. How quickly do you think you need to be moving? How important is it, those first few decisions that you make, and how quickly they're made in order to resolve as best as possible our situation?
Pace is really important, but measured pace. I think it would be really easy to come into a situation and make it worse. You come in, you're panicking, for whatever reason, you're being overly vocal about it, you're being overly direct. And the reality, I think, is that the response to a cyber threat needs to be a team effort. It can't be an individual. And there's a huge amount of culture that's really important in responding to a cyber threat.
And that's a fascinating point that you raise around the decisions that you make could actually escalate the situation rather than repair it. Expand on that a little bit more. What might you do that could perhaps make things worse?
So what Sheila made a really good point at the beginning around, there needs to be a follow-up, there needs to be audit, there needs to be some sort of CSI involved, and you can come in and stamp all over the evidence. But of course, when you're facing up to a cyber threat, probably the last thing in your mind is, am I smudging a few fingerprints, or am I kind of, preventing the investigator from finding out what happened? But let's say you're faced with a cyber attack that you've lost data, and it's a really important operational system. It's underpinning your business. You've got a choice. One of the options you could take is turn the system off. But then, are you doing a disservice to the business? Are you taking away what is actually keeping the business going? When in fact the cyber threat, it might be important, but it may not be catastrophic. It may be containable.
I think you're raising a really good point as well, though, Lee, because what you're touching on is that business impact analysis part of, what generally used to sit under another procedure, which was more around business continuity planning. But what we've seen is incident management, crisis management, IT disaster recovery, data breach recovery. It's all sort of merging together now, and there needs to be that connection between everything.
And I think that's largely because business these days is so digital.
Absolutely.
Because it is so dependent upon technology. Technology isn't a back office function.
Yeah.
In many industries, it is the business. And decisions you can make, if you're turning off a system, there may not be manual workarounds. There may not be a way that the business can operate if you're turning off one of their core systems. You need to consider the business impact of the decisions that you're making.
Yeah. And Jon, you mentioned about, who do we bring in? I think, Richard, you'd sort of said, I'll go to my legal counsel again. Ordinarily, there is somebody who is a data protection officer or a designated data protection officer, or you might have even outsourced that function if you're a middle market business. At some point, depending on the nature of the data that's been lost and the volume, again, that's got to be risk assessed. And, it's ordinarily that individual who should be in that process risk assessing. Do we need to do anything else? Do we need to let, employees know, customers know? Do we need to let the ICO or the FCA or any other regulator know?
And that's hugely important, that role, because not only is the technical, the kind of bits and bytes in the background as you're unpicking everything and doing that forensic part, having someone there that's got a clear, measured head from a PR standpoint is incredibly important, as we've seen with many public cases in the past where people have shared a little bit too much too early, and that can be very damaging. So it's certainly something you have to think about as it unfolds.
And as the chief technology officer in this scenario, obviously those within the business will be looking to you for answers. But just building on what you said there, Richard, the reputational risk that comes with this as well. Not only do we have the financial implications, but the reputational side to it as well. How heavily does that weigh on the decisions that you make at an early stage as to how you deal with this? Because, we've seen so many stories of businesses negatively impacted, Talk, TSB, just to name a couple. And no business wants to be the next.
I think it's hugely important to us internally, and it should be to any company. I think it's, no one should be embarrassed about having a cyber breach, a problem around cyber in this day and age, as we see some huge names out there, and along with a lot of small names. But in a scenario such as this one, I would be very tempted to keep it pretty tight-lipped until we were, probably 2 or 3 days down the line and had some really good technical detail on what we thought the problem was, and generally just go with a holding statement to say, yes, we have an issue. We have fantastic procedures and great third parties that are helping us deal with it. We'll let you know as soon as we possibly can. That's pretty much all you can do, I think.
And Lee, just thinking about the next stage here, you've dealt with the immediate onset of the crisis. What are the next stages one might expect?
There's a real need to learn something from this event, and that covers a couple of things. I think one is you've got to make pretty certain it doesn't happen again. So what caused it? Why did it happen? Who were the key players? Who was involved? What could have been done differently? Everything that goes wrong is an opportunity to learn, and that needs to get fed back into the cyber playbook. You also need to understand, what is the organizational damage. As Richard said there may be a comms plan that needs to come into place, and if it's been a particularly high profile one, you've got to rely on your PR teams, your media comms teams to help you out with that, because there's two fronts. There's the outward front, and then there's the inward. We've got to learn. We've got to prevent it happening again. We've got to update our procedures, our policies.
Yeah. And I do think that beyond the initial containment of the data breach and just dealing with the fallout of that, then you move into reputation management. And we've seen some really interesting high-profile examples recently of both good and bad of that. I've seen some great examples of firms, in the legal sector recently that suffered a data breach, but actually the way they responded was really proactive. As Richard was saying, they didn't try to deny it. They owned up to it. They explained carefully the impact. And then they were saying, look, these are the steps we put in place to manage it again. And actually it was quite low down on the news agenda as a result.
I think that's really a really important point there you raised, Chris. I think there's increasingly, I've observed in the press, a huge sensationalization of cyber crime, and you kind of get these James Bond villains stuck in a lair somewhere with their kind of organized state terrorism, and there probably is that. But there's an equal number of threats that aren't organized crime; they're opportunistic. But there is a huge sensationalism to it, and I think that creates pressure on executives that executives really need to manage well, because it's really important that your team feel part of a safe organization, and that if your first response is to hang somebody out to dry, chances are they're going to try and hide their skeletons from you. And as a CTO, as a CIO, you really do want to know where the skeletons are, and the people that know where they are your team. And so if they're constantly living in fear for your judgment on them, chances are they're not going to come forward, and you're going to be living with more threats than you otherwise would.
So it's an interesting, very, very interesting point you raised there, Lee. Richard, I'll put it to you. How good do you think companies are at acting in just the way that Lee was suggesting?
I think there's a massive variety out there, John, to be honest. And I think in this scenario, coming back to Lee's point, which is a fantastic one, this is an opportunity to increase the maturity of that individual, of that organisation. Learn about all the things we've spoken about now. Certainly not hang out to dry individuals that have made an honest mistake, because as Lee quite rightly says, we all make mistakes, and it's about learning from them. And actually, the fact of actually making those mistakes in the first place actually gives us the opportunity to maybe zero in on what was already a vulnerability that was sitting there anyway.
Yeah. Would you still go for this job?
No.
Given the circumstances, would you be running a mile now?
I'd want to check the contract, that's for sure.
I'd be on a plane somewhere if I was allowed.
Yeah, the ink hasn't quite dried yet, so you might be okay. But great. Well, look, I want to have a chance to put another scenario to you, our second loop challenge. Slightly different scenario, but one that I think opens up, again, some interesting possibilities. So again, you're the Chief Technology Officer for a business, but you've been in the role for a while, and you haven't had the problem that we've just been describing. It wasn't suddenly thrown at you. The business has progressed well with its digital transformation. Your business has recently invested heavily in a new company website. Many of the staff, including yourself, have profile pages on the website that describe your education, your expertise, career history, and a bit of personal information as well that describes the kind of people you are, makes you as a business more approachable, more human. And these pages include some basic contact details as well. And your senior executives, the people that you work with, are big fans of social media. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing when it comes to a CEO, but your senior executives are, and they like to share what they're doing both in and outside of the workplace on various social media platforms. So you get an email. It's an email from your CEO, and you notice it looks like it's from their personal email. It contains a link to something that they want you to read, just a link. What are you going to do with that email? I'm going to come to you first on this one, Richard.
Well, John, this just kind of very much smells of a phishing or whaling attack straight away. Actually, I've witnessed exactly this within Savills, and I think if you speak around the panel, most other people have as well. What do? You make sure that no one clicks on the link. That's the obvious one. If it's coming in, ours is coming in via a mobile provider, so it's pretty much nothing you can do around kind of chasing down chasing down the person that's sending it. For us, it's about the education piece. This is we are not going to stop whaling attacks. We're not going to stop phishing attacks out there. What we are going to stop, or what we'd like to stop, is people actually being taken in by them.
But the email's from the CEO, it's from the boss. So there is a pressure there, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, there is.
How do we deal with that? That's about education, I guess. It's about experience.
It really is. And this is where staff training is so important. And it's one of the key defences, as I'm sure Sheila would agree, from her clients. And then what I'd also say is, I know the scenario talks about it being from the CEO's personal account. It could just as easily be from their corporate account, because that level of sophistication of phishing and whaling is really getting there. And sometimes they'll even go so far as to watch the tone of voice that the CEO or whoever is using, so that it almost sounds like, and there's been instances where someone's received an email from someone asking for you to send them some data, because that's the other scenario here. I know in this scenario it's about clicking on something, but the email could be without attachment, but it could be asking you to send something. And that's where it's really about, look, does this feel right? Does this smell right? And there's no substitute for training there, because if there's no attachment, then no antivirus software in the real world is going to pick that up.
I think training's really important there, Chris, because everyone thinks they're never going to fall for it. Everybody, you think, well, how would I fall for that? Of course I'll see it. But people do. And you'd be surprised at how many people do. And I think one of the best tools actually companies have to condition people is try and fish your own team. Do it in a safe way, but simulate a phishing attack and see how many people do actually fall for it, and you'd be really surprised at how many people actually do.
Now, yeah, Sheila, at RSM, is that the kind of thing that you do for clients, the simulated approach to the kind of challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, absolutely, John. I think what the team have been talking about is different aspects of social engineering. So, phishing, whaling, even tailgating into buildings, bin dipping, there's all sorts of things. There's vishing, there's all sorts of things we can talk about.
Vishing?
Vishing.
Just explain that one a bit more.
Yeah. So, it's a type of phishing, but it's very virtual in nature. So, again, sort of targeting more social media types of accounts. And, there's a whole host of these different types of attacks out there. I think that's the thing to be aware of. You don't necessarily need to know the technical terminology. It's about the awareness that's really important. And actually the culture of the organization in terms of that awareness, the training, the education, it has to be driven top down. If we've got a team of senior executives who are sitting there who sort of understand cyber, don't really understand what the cyber threat landscape is, are thinking, well, I've got an IT team, they can go away and sort of deal with this for us. I'm afraid that culture is not going to permeate down to the level that you need it to be, right from the top, right down to the bottom, because cyber criminals are really, really clever. They will profile individuals right across your organization, and they're always looking for the weakest link. And that weakest link could be at any layer in your organization. So, tone from the top. Accountability actually sits with the chief exec for cyber. So, you might have the most wonderful IT team, with some great CTOs and CIOs leading those teams. But when there is a big data breach or cyber attack, I'm afraid it's the CEO who's going to get dragged onto the TV to explain what happened.
We've spoken a lot about the risks here, the challenges, the problems. Are there any reasons to be optimistic? I'm going to come to you first on this, Lee. Can we be optimistic amid all of this?
Well, I'm generally optimistic about most things. But I do think yes, we can and we absolutely should. I mean, the increased attention to this is actually a good thing, because industry as a whole needs to respond and is responding. And as quickly as cyber criminals innovate, so do those people that are defending against it. And I think collectively the bar is getting raised, and it's getting raised more quickly than it has in the past, because it is now such a hot topic and people are talking about it. It's never going away. This, if to coin a phrase, is the new normal. And it will be a constant cat and mouse game between cyber criminals and cyber defenders. And I think businesses as a whole will need to adopt information security and cyber security practices as a core component of their operating model. It'll need to become a differentiator. It'll need to become a reason that companies succeed. And I think increasingly there's awareness at board level and beyond that this is something to take really seriously. So yeah, I am hopeful.
And Richard, would you share Lee's cautious optimism?
100%. And to add to that, to Lee's comments, we're seeing clients now saying, you need this level of maturity. You need to prove to us that you have these controls. You can recover from, bad situations, because they happen to all people. So I would absolutely echo Lee's point regarding the raising of the profile of this. I think it's a good thing in some ways. Also on another slight point, the tools that we have around us now that are readily available are so much better than they ever used to be. I mean, just to pick one example, just the fact that most people are running Office 365 in the cloud now. Pretty much all major corporates have that application, and the sophistication behind it is really quite impressive. And this isn't something that you have to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds a year to achieve. You can achieve, some good base controls just with the things that come out of the box. So definitely have a look at your existing tooling and ask the vendors and say, what else can you do to help us protect ourselves in this area? And I think it's a good thing.
I think some fascinating insights and thoughts from all of you. What we like to do, though, here on The Loop is finish with a top tip from each of our guests. So while we're still on that optimistic note, you can take it in any direction that you like, but we'd like your top single piece of advice that you would give to a middle market business when it comes to cybersecurity. Sheila, I'm going to come to you first.
I think focus on the basics, core controls. Some of this is not new. Antivirus, patching, user education and awareness, policies and procedures. We're not talking about something that's earth-shatteringly new here.
And Chris?
I think for me, I would try to avoid treating information security in isolation from the rest of what you're doing around data governance and indeed staff training, because I think that's where it gets more interesting for our people. Is, for example, we're trying to drive a big data literacy program within RSM so that every one of our 4,000 people understands the importance of data in the organization, how to govern it, how to deliver insight from it. And if you build in information security training into that wider, skill set development, because they'll see that kind of training as something that's good for their future careers, rather than just a box ticking exercise. Oh, I've got to do the information security training again. If you make it something that's part of something that's useful for their careers, I think then they're much more likely to engage with it and remember it.
And Richard, from your perspective, what would your single piece of advice be to that middle market company?
I think my single piece of advice, John, would be everyone needs a friend, I think, in this scenario. So third-party relationships, find someone that can help you out, play through, said scenarios, build a relationship with them. Because if you're a middle market company, as we've said earlier on, you're not going to have all the skills on the bench that you need. So find the skills out there, foster a good relationship with them, and get ready to have to call them, should the worst happen.
So cooperation, name of the game here.
Absolutely.
And Lee, final word to you. What would your piece of advice be?
Take Richard's advice.
Always have a friend.
But I think that's particularly salient and very important. I think the only thing that I would add to that is stepping into this role. Spend some time finding your skeletons, but do it in a safe way. there will be something that's gone wrong in the organisation to date. There'll be technical debt. There'll be things that people are probably hiding for fear of repercussions. But create an environment where those skeletons can be discussed and talked about and drawn out in a safe way. Culture is really important. I think your team are your best defence, but they could also be your biggest weakness if you don't get them on site and you don't get them working with you. So find your skeletons, but create a nice culture that allows them to expose them and talk about them in a safe way.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately we are out of time. Lee, Richard, Chris, Sheila, thank you all very much indeed. And if you want to find out more about cybersecurity, then please have a look at RSM's most recent Cyber Security Insights report. You can find it at rsmuk.com/real-economy/cybersecurity. Easier to say than perhaps to write down. We're always keen to hear your views, so please do rate us and leave a review. And to stay in the loop, please subscribe to The Loop and listen to our next episode where we'll untangle more of today's big business issues.